Shalom. Hello again. Welcome back to our Pilgrim series. We're looking at Israel through the eyes of first-time pilgrims. And on last week's program, we were in Galilee, and we were here in Tiberias is where we stayed. We took a boat across the sea to Capernaum and the Mount of Beatitudes. We traveled through the valley of Armageddon. We saw Nazareth, Jesus' boyhood home. We saw Megiddo, the city stacked up of many periods. We saw the Jordan River where our people were baptized. We planted some trees. And today we're going south past Bethshean, which we also saw. And we're going down the Jordan River Valley past the hill of Samaria to Jericho, located here. And from Jericho we'll go up this high mountain to Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And here we make our ascension, our aliyah to the holy city. Jericho is of interest. There, of course, this is the world's oldest city. The walls fell down, and in its long history, this was probably the most climactic moment. There was also a sycamore tree in that town where Zacchaeus, a short man, climbed the tree in order to be able to see the speaker, Jesus Christ. And Dr. Tom McCall of our staff spoke to our group of pilgrims under a sycamore tree in Jericho.
Jesus came through Jericho several times when he would be here for his own baptism, and then went up to the Mount of Temptation, and then when he would come from Galilee to Jerusalem. This is the way to come. The road to Jericho was an important area coming from Jerusalem to Galilee. But on one occasion he was here and saw a man up in a sycamore tree. It turned out to be Zacchaeus. And this sycamore tree is not that old, but it gives us some idea of what the sycamore looked like when Zacchaeus and Jesus were in the town of Jericho. And it was a good climbing tree, and somebody who was short could climb up in it and see over the crowds. But while he could see Jesus, which is what he wanted to do, Jesus also saw him, and he told him, I want you to come down. I want to come to your house to have dinner with you.
Leaving Jericho, we travel westward to just south of Jerusalem, to the site of our Lord's birth, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. Below the main floor, stairs lead to what is traditionally the exact spot where Jesus was born. Tom McCall recounts the story from the Gospels.
It came to pass, as the angels were gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, Let us now go even unto Bethlehem, and see this thing which is come to pass, which the Lord has made known unto us. And they came with haste, and found Mary and Joseph, and the babe lying in a manger.
Taking another stairway, we go down to the dimly lit burial chamber of St. Jerome. He is famous for being the first to translate the Old Testament from the ancient Hebrew to the language of his day, Latin. Before leaving Bethlehem, however, the group took some time to shop for souvenirs. For centuries, it has been customary for pilgrims to walk into Jerusalem as a sign of respect. So the group disembarked from the bus and entered the city through the Old Jaffa Gate and gathered together by David's Tower, as Tom read from the Psalms.
Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper who love thee. Peace be within thy walls, and prosperity within thy palaces. For my brethren and companions' sake, I will now say, peace be within thee. Because of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek thy good. This is a song sung by the pilgrims as they came to Jerusalem and entered into the gates and rejoiced because they were near the presence of the Lord and the house of the Lord, the Beit HaMikdash, the temple.
Jesus who died, now glorified, King of all kings.
This is the same view of Jerusalem that Abraham and Isaac had, believe it or not. The way I'm facing, if I went over that hill and went on and on for a while, I'd come to Beersheba, where they originated from when God told them, take thy son, thine only son, to a certain mountain I will tell thee of in Moriah. Now, that mountain, Mount Moriah as it's called today, we can see. It's, well, you see the Golden Dome, Dome of the Rock, and it is sitting on Mount Moriah. It's a little mountain, if you can see it, in the middle of a bowl. See what I mean? A larger mountain on the right is the Mount of Olives. And to the other side, northern Jerusalem, Mount Zion, and so on. But in the middle is a kind of a swelling. And that is Mount Moriah. That's all God really asked for, you know, as a platform there. For somebody that owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, it wasn't much to ask for. And it's not even the highest mountain, as you can easily see from here. But it was the mountain on which he wanted Isaac offered in sacrifice. That's the beginning of Jerusalem, really, is the sacrifice on Mount Moriah. There wasn't really exactly a city here then, but Abraham reported to Melchizedek, we say Melchizedek, but Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, he paid tithes to him. This place was called something like Salem or Shalom or something like that. But in any case, that's where it all starts. Then later, after the children of Israel went down into Egypt for the 400 years of slavery and then came back, and there were judges, and then they started to want a king and so on. Jerusalem comes back into the picture. David, of course, was the king after Saul, and he thought that Jerusalem would make a fine capital of Israel. It's sort of like Washington, D.C. It doesn't belong to North or South. It's kind of a land of its own. And David, as it tells us in the early Chronicles and so on, came up and managed to take the city. And that's where the real 3,000-year history starts that they are now celebrating. Now, let me give you a timeline. We started about 2000 B.C. with Abraham. The children of Israel returned roughly around 1500 B.C. and were ruled by the judges and so on for a time. They elected Saul at about 10-something B.C. and David around 1000 B.C., give or take, and Solomon after that, 40 years. And then it was in the 8th century before Christ that the northern tribes were carried off. And it was in 605 B.C. that Nebuchadnezzar and the families of the north, the Chaldeans and so on, as prophesied by Jeremiah, laid siege to Jerusalem. And it took a long time, from 605 B.C. to 586. That's almost 20 years. They finally overran it and looted the place and destroyed it and broke it all up. And Judah was carried off. And then little by little they were released. Cyrus of Persia, whom the Bible calls God's anointed, released the people to come back. The 10 northern tribes wandered back. We're at about 500 BC, and people are talking about rebuilding the temple because they're back. And Zerubbabel, for one, and so on, getting a foundation laid. The second temple slowly comes up, and it's very small. I mean, I stressed to you how big Solomon's was. This second temple was in comparison like a two-car garage. It was just nothing much. But then Haggai said in verse 2:7, "Yet I will fill this house with glory." And that was the temple that was to come down all the way to the 1st century through occupation by the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all four of which empires came and went through here. Armies, legions, riding back and forth. If you stood on this hill, you would see different flags and different outfits and different weapons all that time. But the Jews persisted here, occupied and under vassal kings and so on, all the way until Herod, who remodeled the temple back into the magnificence equal to Solomon's. And you will see that when we go to the model of the city, how magnificent a temple he built. In fact, the Talmud says, he who has not seen Herod's temple has not seen a beautiful building. So it really was a job. Beautiful. Well, that is when Messiah came, of course, in the 1st century. And now I'm halfway up to the present day. And if you stood here, you would have seen, well, Messiah sleeping in Bethany. See the tower on the Mount of Olives? Go off to the right, and behind the trees, there's a little village there. His friend Lazarus lived there. He was welcome at Lazarus' house, having raised him from the dead. He and his men passed the time there before Passover. And if you had been there in the year of our Lord's Passion, you would have seen him come up that hill, the Mount of Olives, get on a donkey, and come down the other side, riding down to the eastern gate. Now that would be to the right of the gold dome, around the wall going to the north. We're in the southern part, so we can't see the gate from here. But we can see his route, because it would be from where the towers are down into the valley and then back up the little hill of Moriah. And you would have seen people lining the road, shouting, "Hoshianu, save us." Those people must have been saved. Waving palm branches. And the priests plotting. Look, the whole world's gone after him. I don't have to tell you all the things that happened in the gospel, but if you stood here, imagine what you would have seen then in the next 60 years, 70 years. Gosh, Roman occupation, building, and finally another siege of the temple, imagine. And they destroyed the place again down to the ground, as Jesus had prophesied. Judaism in Israel almost ceased to exist from there. They sort of recovered enough that under Rabbi Akiva and a false Messiah named Bar-Kokhba, in 135 AD there was a revolt against Rome again, but that was hopeless, and 580,000 more were killed. I tell you, the killing of Jews has gone on from time immemorial, and it's still going on. And it's hard to understand other than as a plan of God's enemy. Well, what happened then? The Romans continued to occupy the place and keep the Jews out. Hadrian built the Temple of Jupiter. If you stood here and watched the mountain, you would see Roman pillars go up, and then a temple to a god Jupiter on purpose on the Jewish temple site, hopelessly desecrating the place so the Jews wouldn't come and worship anymore. And then their temple began to deteriorate and their empire deteriorate, and the Eastern Roman Empire came in, Constantinople. Now then you have a peculiar situation, because all in a day, this Queen Helena and her son Constantine, well, they decided all the people in their empire ought to be Christians like they were, so they decreed that as fact. So you had millions and millions of unbelievers now that were consecrated as Christians by federal decree, and they just came riding in. And Queen Helena picked out holy sites, and Constantine, with childlike ecstasy, pointing out places and saying that they belong to the gospel and whatever. Some may be accurate, some very, very strange, but they were the Byzantine Christians. They were here for 300-400 years. You know, I taught this once on our program. And in the long history, which I was doing from memory, I neglected that period. And when I made the close of the show back in Dallas, I said, gee, I forgot the Byzantine period, and it occurred to me that period itself, that small period that I neglected to mention, was twice the size of the United States in time. This city is that old, folks. Can you imagine what other city could begin to celebrate a 3,000th birthday? You know, and 300 would be a distinguishing characteristic. Well, okay, we're up to the Byzantines now. They held on to the place more or less, came and went from 4th century to the 7th century, 350 or so years, and then Mohammed was born, and things really take a turn. Now comes replacement theology at its apex. The Muslims are going to replace Judaism and Christianity, and they ride up with tough armies, and they take the place over, and they built the Dome of the Rock, the building with the gold dome that you can see plainly there, and that's it. That's the 1,300-year-old building. That's what they built. It's been remodeled and refurbished many times. The dome has recently been replaced, and it's gleaming and beautiful, but essentially that's the building they built. The Dome of the Rock was built, finished 691 AD, and it wasn't until 999 the Crusaders from Europe came, Christian soldiers marching through here and trying to get this place back for the Lord. And boy, those were some battles. Here come the Christian armies lopping off heads and teaching love, and and slaughtering Jews and Arabs alike. And if truth be told, there were very, very bloody times. I can't imagine God being pleased with anybody on these missions because of the death rate, for one thing. And they did conquer the place. Then the Mamelukes from Egypt, other Muslims came in. Then the Ottoman Turks, still other Muslims came from the north. And that takes us all the way up to the period about World War I. The Turkish people occupied it from 1517 to about 1917. And at that time, General Allenby of England rode his horse to Jerusalem, got off and walked in like you did, and would not ride his horse into this city. Took it without firing a shot, and it became a British protectorate or mandate. And the British had issued a Balfour Declaration saying that the Jews ought to be able to have a homeland here with their long history in the place and so on. And that's where the present problems are given birth, sort of, because the Muslims were here and saying, yeah, to make them a homeland somewhere else, and so on. But, you know, the Jews have a very good argument to have a homeland here. They predate the Muslims. But you put two people in a very small land, and that started something going. And, you know, if you stood here in 1948, you'd see war in 1967. You'd see a heck of a war with the Israelis coming from the east, down the Mount of Olives, into the temple site. Just the path of the Lord, taking the old city and the temple site, giving it back to the Muslim waqf for the religious authority to keep the Muslim buildings. At last, Jerusalem is free and open to Christian, Jew, and Muslim alike. It was not while the Muslims held it, but the Jews freed it up. And then in 73, you would have seen still more fighting, but the Jews held on. And 1987, the Intifada, and then this disastrous peace process, which is, I think, leading to the next phase, which is going to be Armageddon. I don't think we're getting peace at all, but the kind of peace that the prophet Daniel spoke of in Daniel 8:25, referring to the Antichrist, he said, by peace shall he destroy many. Many lives are being lost now as we speak in pursuing this peace process. And this is putting Israel in a position, I would say, without being dogmatic about it, to have to negotiate with some outsider, somebody for protection, especially if they keep giving territory away, and that somebody may one day be the Antichrist, coming up with a 7-year contract. That seems so reasonable now. You know, when I taught this 25 years ago, people say, where'd you get that stuff? Well, now, I mean, well, that's no news. They read it in the paper. People are riding up with peace ideas every day. So the prophecy's coming into focus. It really is. And I think you know the rest of the story. Happy times when Armageddon is at last, well, it's in the middle, and the Lord comes and puts a stop to it, saying, if I had not come then, there'd be no flesh saved. And begins a 1,000-year kingdom. And if you stood here then even, then you would see a splendid Jerusalem, a palace. Well, you will stand here, and you will live in that palace as the wife of the king. You know, whether we get 70 or whatever we get down here as Americans, we will all be 1,000 years Israelis. This is your hometown. This is why Yossi, when he meets you at the airport, says, welcome home. I mean, what are you going to be if you, unless you're in the foreign service, you're going to be living in Jerusalem. A queen lives with a king. So congratulations, you're engaged. And you're looking at your, at the site of your future home. You really are. If the Bible is at all accurate, that's just where we're going to live. There it is. And then finally, at the end of time, literally, at the Revelation 22, at the end of the Bible, Revelation 21, the mysterious period called eternity begins. And in eternity, we have a new heaven, a new earth, and one earthly city survives, a new Jerusalem.
When he touched their eyes, the blind were made to see again. The deaf could hear, the mute could speak. So it was with me. Does he still touch lives, heal the blind and make them to see, deaf to hear, mute to laugh, all of them are me. I came like the people there, looking for a crutch, sick and tired of the ways of the world, desperate for his touch. Once blind, now I to see, once deaf I hear, and though lame in his pathways I walk, whispering in his ear. Lord, you touched my heart. Thank you, Lord, and thank you again. Bless you till I see you again. Bless your holy name.
Well, Tom, good to have you back in the studio.
Thank you. Good to be back, Zola.
You've always been a scholar of Jerusalem. Last year we made this series, Jerusalem 3000, and there's been some changes. There's been an election. Jerusalem's being talked about everywhere.
Well, we would hope that the changes are for the better, and one would hope for peace. We do pray for the peace of Jerusalem, as you instruct us every week, and as King David did also. Mm-hmm. But I think really the fulfillment of that prayer is going to be similar to the fulfillment of the Lord's prayer, where he said, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And really, true peace isn't going to come to Jerusalem until the Prince of Peace comes to the city of peace and reigns.
That's the only time we can count on it, isn't it? The prophet Zechariah describes Jerusalem in ways that it looks like he's been reading our newspapers, really up to date.
Oh, it's amazing, Zola, that Zechariah 2,500 years ago would say that in the end times, the city of Jerusalem would be a cup of trembling. That's like a cup with an intoxicating liquid in it that would make the nations drunk, and they stagger around and they get drunk and intoxicated over this city. And that's an amazing, and we see that beginning to happen even now as they're talking about what shall we do with Jerusalem and what will happen to Jerusalem in the future. And it's also a stone of stumbling that crushes anybody that tries to deal with it or or tries to lift it, they get a hernia, and it's just a burdensome stone.
Zechariah
To the
said
nations.
that too. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the way it's going to be. We have no doubt until the Lord returns.
But then he said, "They shall look upon me whom they've pierced."
That's the good news. And the whole nation of Israel will receive Jesus as the Messiah and say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Israel will be saved, and then he will judge the Gentiles on how they've treated Israel, especially during the tribulation, and bring the sheep Gentiles, believers, along with believing Israel, into his kingdom that he's prepared from the foundation of the earth.
Oh, great teaching in a short time. Thanks. We're going to video by Richard Jones, one of our pilgrims at this point.
That's where old Zacchaeus was, somewhere up in there, because he was a little bitty man.
Jump your heads.
There, April's surrounded by soldiers.
I'm happy right now.
And Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.